You're tuned in to the MTG Cable cast, where they cover Magic, the Gathering Finance. All right? You don't know about it? You're tuned in right now and get ready to learn some shit. Buckle your seatbelts and light a blunt and get ready for the MTG Cable cast. Starring Reptar and Thirsty, them onion head motherfuckers.
Alrighty, guys. Welcome to the newest episode of the Cabal Cast. And this week, we're going to bring you still topical because ban list, and continuing with our last episode about the ban list into this one, what the look back of this most recent ban and restricted announcement was. As weird as it is to say, I feel like this was one of the most anticipated ban and restricted announcements I can recall in a very long time.
Yeah.
Shook up a lot of formats, so what does that mean? What does it make us feel about our overall faith in WotC's decision-making, to piggyback on last episode? And with that, let's take it away.
Right, so we're basically just going to go top to bottom. We start with Standard, and we see no changes for Standard, and as we discussed last time, that seems appropriate. The format is still being worked on. Frank Karsten dropped a small data set earlier this morning of recording, and the Standard winners metagame is, as we discussed not too long ago, there's the Domain Ramp deck on top that I was pretty sure was going to rule the roost. The Golgari mid-range deck, though, after that is, I think, a little too high. And then Rakdos Lizards is a deck that everybody's been talking about recently because they think it's really unique, and you know what? At the end of the day, I can't fault them for that. So Standard looks fine. No changes. That cool. If Domain just inevitably takes over the format again and pushes everything down, then yeah, we'll probably see Atraxa go, which is a card they have noted before. So I'm fine with no Standard changes. We just saw a rotation, cool, let it be, you know?
Yeah.
No thoughts? Only vibes?
No, I mean, that was basically what we both said last episode. It's like, look, Standard just had what is hopefully the final rotation change, and it hit. So these are all sets that were designed under this change.
Yep.
So it should be good now. Just let it ride out for a bit. And I think they made the correct decision here.
Yep. For Pioneer, the bans were Amalia, Benavide, Aguirre, and Sorin Imperius, Bloodlord. And at the end of the day, I think these are fine. I think these are fine options. Yeah. They reinvigorate the format a little bit. The reasoning for Amalia is, as we said, the squeeze that put us on the format is a little too difficult to deal with, and so it's hard to kind of create creatures. It's like a birthing pod situation where the more creatures you can put into this toolbox deck, the worse it gets overall for the game. WotC also cited, as we talked about, tournament logistics, where this is effectively a deck that can just steal all the time in a tournament. And it's a creature combo deck, so it's kind of difficult to interact with within that format. Fine, cool, end of the day, it's gone, awesome. Sorin Imperius Bloodlord has been likened to show and tell for vampires, and I think that is apt. It does a little too much for the vampire deck, especially with Vein Ripper in the format. And the reason cited, I think, was perfectly fine. If we get rid of Vein Ripper, that means there's another vampire that could take its place, because Sorin's just going to do the same thing with that one later on. So you cut Sorin, and we'll work around it later on. And it seems like Pioneer is in kind of a fine place when we take a look. Is it Phoenix as expected on top? After that, Atarka Red, for me, is a little bit of a surprise. I've seen that deck in my RCQs when I was judging. It always floated middle to bottom of the pack.
Yeah.
And then everything after that is also kind of a wild surprise that people are all over this stuff. Lotus Field is extremely low on this list, and Mono Green Devotion is in the middle of the pack. I honestly thought Mono Green Devotion would have a little more representation right now than it currently does. Otherwise, this looks fine for the time being.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the Pioneer stuff was overall very good. I did think it was very interesting that in the announcement they mentioned Fable of the Mirror Breaker.
Yes, that is a card that I thought they would have gotten rid of instead of Sorin and kind of let the chips fall where they may. But I understand the reason for getting rid of Sorin. And
absolutely, and I understand their reasoning for keeping Fable. It's just funny that even when they've let Fable slide, after so many announcements where they were like, hey, we're watching it, it's not as relevant as it could be, but we're watching it still.
Yeah.
Was nice. The other thing that I thought was really interesting was that they kind of, hey, look, we made mistakes with these cards. We were looking at other things. I like the transparency of it. And I think that the metagame, changes were reflected well. Although, again, Atarka Red is not a deck I've seen at like high levels of play for a while.
Yep.
So that was kind of weird. But mission accomplished.
Yeah.
You did the right thing.
Yeah. There's a theme for this ban list that I'm going to touch on at the end because it is applicable to Pioneer, Modern, and Legacy. So I'll hold off my thoughts on that before I move to Modern.
Yeah.
Okay. And then for Modern, they took Nadu out of the format, which was the base level expectation. And then from downtown, they just aced Grief. That card. A lot of people said that should have gone before Fury. And at the end of the day, I don't really know if Fury needed to be removed from the format on the whole, because the creature decks that I assume, wanted to come back have not come back. The format is turn 3, and creature decks are too slow. If they're not combo decks, are too slow for that. So Grief was a wild ban, but Nadu going was an obvious selection. And they basically are going to let this format breathe. And this is fine. Like, I think the Nadu ban was appropriate. Grief seems wildly... It's like they're just throwing punches here and hoping they land appropriately. Grief wasn't running the format like it had been when people were clamoring for a Grief ban in Modern. And so much has gone on since that point in time that I don't know how relevant this is going to be. WotC does mention the prevalence of play in, I believe they mentioned it, in the Goryo's Vengeance Reanimator deck and the mono black, I don't know what you want to call it, the Necrodominance deck.
Yeah, the Necrodominance
and
one, yep.
You can play both of those decks without Grief. It was just a convenient card because it costs no mana. I don't know if the Goryo's Vengeance deck plays Thoughtseize, but if it doesn't, it will, because Thoughtseize can target the owner. You can Thoughtseize yourself. It's a powerful option. Similarly with the Necrodominance deck, if it's not playing Thoughtseize, it will, or it'll play Duress. There are options behind that. Grief is just a 0 mana interaction way to do things for decks that like to be light on mana overall. So cool, I guess.
Yeah, I liked the Grief ban because I thought it was one of the things outside of the speed of the format that was suppressing a lot of control decks from existing. Obviously, because Stoneforge is bad then. But Nadu absolutely needed to happen. I still, and I know there was a meme floating around about it that was like, there's no one ring deck terrorizing the format, and it was like the Goldfish top 10 meta share, 2 decks with Grief, and everything else had the one ring.
Yeah, it's not one
ban
deck.
The one ring.
It's
all of them.
It's all of them. Yeah, that was
literally the format.
That was good. Yeah, that was a kind of a tone deaf statement for sure.
Yeah, it didn't really make sense to me. The one thing that was really interesting was when they were talking about actual like decks in the format, and they said as far as the different archetypes that they wanted to see thrive, they said Energy and Eldrazi decks were themes we took intentional shots at propping up. That was interesting to me because that is the first time I can remember them saying, like, we designed Modern Horizons to define the modern format. They've said, obviously, we designed Modern Horizons for the modern format.
Yeah.
But this was them saying, no, we are trying to drive this format in a direction. And that's the first time I can remember them with Modern ever saying that. And like, we want to go this way.
The marketing copy for the first one, including such bangers as "we will not disrupt the modern format," or "our attempt is not to disrupt the modern format, only enhance it to augment it." And every set has done the exact opposite. So
the exact opposite, yeah.
Yes.
And it's, come on, guys.
But to be fair, for those 2 decks, they did a really good job with that. Necrodominance.
They did do a very good job.
Yeah.
As Frank's data shows, I mean, when you look at his modern win a game, or his modern like meta share, those decks are doing well.
Yeah.
They are. And hey, power to him. Energy, Eldrazi, you made him tier 1. This is, of all of the bans, the one I think, because of from way downtown, as you alluded to, Grief is going to do the most to shake up any of the formats. I think most of the other ones we kind of know where they're going after this.
Yeah.
But this one, the Grief being so out of left field, is, I think, one of the biggest changes on the whole list, if not the biggest.
Yeah,
Modern.
when we were talking about, and I say we here, and I don't mean you and I on the podcast. I mean my locals were talking about banning Grief. Like, man, it had to have been, again, close to almost a year ago. The concern was you peel back the layer of Grief and what is there, and it looks like the Grief ban in Modern is specifically directed towards that, which is just, we're going to remove Nadu from the format, and we do not want Grief to be the next best thing, so we're going to get ahead of that one.
Yeah.
And I think that's fine. They saw through that problem, so I guess cool story. We'll just leave Grief legal in Vintage where nobody plays that card.
Yeah, that card's not good there.
And then we just have the quick drive-by. Grief is banned in Legacy. Cool. We'd only been asking for that for 8 months. We finally got our wish ahead of EW for once, as opposed to after EW, which has been a problem in the past. They let Renin 6 live a little too long. They let Ragavan live a little too long. They like to see what happens at EW, and I'm pretty sure you can find text in the ban restricted lists for the fall of each year that involved that, which is just like, we wanted to wait and see what players did at EW with this. Like, whatever.
Yeah, cool. That's great. Let people who plan their entire year around this event be your petri dish.
Yeah, exactly. And then, to the surprise of no one, we got some action in Vintage, which has actually been seeing a lot of updates over the past year, I think.
Yeah.
When you got the Ponder stuff, things like that. Urza Saga is restricted. Vexing Bauble is restricted. And on the surface, this maintains parity with the idea of, at one point in time, Mishra's Workshop was restricted. Then we unrestricted it, and it costs a lot of money. We cannot afford to restrict Mishra's Workshop, so any artifact that gets played in that deck will just henceforth be restricted. But at the end of the day, when you read through the Vintage, the verbiage around this, it is very good. It appears that they are actually keeping an eye on Vintage. Urza Saga wasn't maligned in the format. It did a lot for the format, and I think the downward pressure that Vexing Bauble put on the format alongside Saga was kind of the nail in the coffin for both of these cards to go. I don't think either of them was terribly oppressive. They are a pain in the ass, both of them, alongside Luris, because once Vexing Bauble was released, it basically became the best thing to be doing with Luris outside of cycling Dress Down, because you can toggle the bauble. You can just flip that switch manually with Luris after a point in time. So you get your zeros, your opponent doesn't. And that is a very,
it's not fun.
No, it's not. And it puts a stranglehold on the game. It really just shrinks things down and makes the game about Vexing Bauble, not Luris. And so it's a weird way to play Vintage, which is a weird format on the whole. Both of these, again, seem fine to me. Nothing was out of line. The reasoning seems solid. There was a lot of context around certain other cards in the format and citing accelerants and things like Mox Opal, which is interesting because they cited it and I didn't realize that card was unrestricted in the format.
Yep.
That was news to me. So it looks like they're just trying to find a way to keep Mox Opal legal for the non-workshop decks while making it more difficult for the workshop decks.
Yeah.
Cool, I guess. I'm not a Vintage gamer, and the one time I did get to play Vintage in the last year, I just slammed Oath, so I didn't care either way.
Yeah. No, this was one that I actually liked. I agree with the reasoning. It's... again, it's not. They put it well. When you play Vintage, it's to do big dumb things.
Mm-hmm.
It's big dumb things. The format.
Yeah.
For degens, and to shut that down is like a pretty big feels bad. I also think, and this is obviously a very short or very low, quantity of samples here, but to see them, and especially with this announcement specifically, and I guess it really is just Vexing Bauble and Nadu and Modern. Well, we may touch that later in Legacy. I know people are trying, but like,
Mm-hmm.
They were at least quick to react for how it impacted not the format it was designed for.
Yeah.
Cool. I respect that, you know. Maybe just make it not legal in those, and you'll never have to do this again.
Yeah. As you were...
Why do my MH3 Commander cards work in Legacy but not Modern?
That's a fun one. Sorry, while you were discussing that, I was bringing up the vintage MTG metagame dashboard that has been archived now because the data will be out of date soon. And I was just looking at like what the meta percent share of decks was, and it's shops, other shops, and then Luris.
Yep. Yeah.
Oh, and then Initiative, because that deck is approachable.
Yeah. It's like when Powerless Eldrazi was in the format and everyone played Vintage.
Yeah.
Because Powerless Eldrazi.
Yeah, why the hell not? And I'll link these through, like we'll link the Frank Carson tweets and everything so you can take a look at the data yourself. It is weird that Nadu is now a commander card, again, legal in Legacy, just like the Initiative stuff. But at the end of the day, it is exactly in the format it needs to be in, with degenerates that knew exactly what this card was going to do the moment that was spoiled.
Yeah.
So I guess it's fine. There are people that are playing it because they wanted to feel something and cast Thoracle. So yeah, fine, cool, I guess. For the time being, that's all I have to say about the Nadu ban. Overall, I think this is a fine way to start a ban and restricted list for Modern and Legacy. I feel okay about this list. The verbiage that came with it that goes over their choices was all right. And I think what we're seeing in all of these formats is the theme is we're going to skim off the top layer, see what happens, and revisit. That's kind of the message that I got from reading this ban list and understanding what's actually happening in Modern and Legacy and Pioneer to a degree, from a judge standpoint than from an actual player standpoint, because none of my locals really engage with Pioneer.
Yeah, this one sat kind of strange with me overall. When I first saw it, I was like, oh, you know, this is overall really good. Thought about it for a little bit, and what I came up with is basically this ban and restricted announcement was good. But it would have been great in some cases 2 announcements ago. In some formats, obviously, they couldn't do anything till now, and that's good.
Yeah.
But you need to recognize problems quicker and act a little bit more fluidly to things. Because at this point, you have to understand this is your product that you make and have been making for 30 years. And this has continually been an issue that you have brought up yourselves. You got to do better. You can't not. And that was what really stunk about it for me.
Yeah.
And then all the stuff came out about the design change to Nadu and needing to be for Commander, whatever else. And there was obviously, you know, a ton of discourse on Twitter, and I want to shout out the man, the myth, the legend, P-Souls, Patrick Sullivan, at Basic Mountain. He, as he usually does, sums up the problem very well. And it in response to the overall discourse over designing for Commander, he says, of course you should design for Commander. For each opponent, or if you have 30 or more life, is great. That is designing around Commander. That's awesome. What is being asked is for power level or play pattern feedback on the format where you can play Soul Ring, and the whole thing is regulated by localized Rule 0 to be ignorable. So if we're designing this for this format, this this is what the product's going to. But some of the cards are going to be designed for other stuff. No.
Yep.
Just you have to test it somehow. And he followed it up with the whole thing is being written like Michael made a late change, and not Michael left a meeting with Commander people and felt compelled to make a late redesign. That's a problem.
Yep. Yeah, and that's something I keyed into as well on Twitter and the various discords that I flow through, is that the root cause analysis, when you pull everything away and you say what was the initial element, the initial domino that was tipped that led us
to
here.
This catastrophe.
Yep, and it could be one of two things. Either somebody said, but in Commander this is too powerful. Or sorry, this isn't powerful enough, whatever it is. Redesign it. Either that, or the person that is in charge of reviewing these cards for Commander was allowed to sit in that meeting. One of those two is the root cause analysis. Anything outside of that is not. It is all just additional dominoes in the chain that led to Nadu getting printed that same way. And you can basically kind of look at that and see that it's not always Commander design that leads to it. A lot of people like to cite Skull Clamp because that's one of the first times WotC came out and said, hey, we messed up. Yeah, we were doing X when we should have been doing Y. And the root cause analysis for that one was they were just not playing Skull Clamp like the players did. I'm pretty sure we found the BNR before in the Wayback Machine and linked it. They say they were playing Skull Clamps in their Wizard decks. There was no Wizard deck being played in the standard format. Whoever was playtesting at WotC was at fault there. That was root cause analysis, and that has spurred change. We have seen higher quality future league testers. We've seen pros move in. We've seen just wild changes there. Now we're seeing that Commander has a seat at this table, and when the time strikes, I think PCLA also cited initiative. That wasn't something that I thought of either.
Yeah.
Similarly, stickers.
Yep. We saw what happened to those last band announcements.
How do we get these to work in Commander? Is generally speaking the first domino or the first chip that falls that leads us to design problems. And we can go back over the last couple of years and see that it's generally spurred from Commander. And there is a lot of tone-deaf responses from Aaron Forsyth and Mark Rosewater about this. And I don't care. Learn your lesson. That's it. You can't design around Commander for constructed level sets at the last minute.
No.
Or generally speaking, at all. Like the purpose of these sets is to push stuff for Modern. So why are we designing for Commander? Do that in the Commander decks that you put out with these products. Like, cool, it's right there. There was a lands deck. There was a Simic lands deck that came out with this set.
Yeah.
Put Nadu in that. That could be the face Commander instead of whatever they put on it.
Right.
Yeah, perfectly fine. You got it. You got to buy the main set to get Springheart and Tuco. There you go. That's how you get players. Like, cool. Give an upgrade video like Gavin Verhey. Sit down and do that. Whatever. Bring in whomever you want. The Game Nights crew to do the upgrades, or Tomer or whomever, and let them do that. Cool. Fine. Awesome. But that was the hands down the worst part about this. Like,
yeah. It really is the most 2 steps forward, 1 step back of like, okay, but this is also a whole nother issue that contributes to this issue we're talking about now.
Yeah. And
you should try to fix it. There was buried in some of the Twitter sphere over this, there was some guy that was like, it's strange that it went from this product is not for you to now every product is for Commander, even the ones nominally designed for other formats.
Yeah.
Absolutely. That is what it is, and that's terrible.
It's where your bread is buttered. You have to design for. They're not the lowest common denominator at this point. They are the most common denominator at this point. And constructed players are your lowest common denominator. So it is what it is. We're going to have that happen. But when you have these sets that are dedicated to this product, it is going to be a problem every time.
Every time.
And Upcycled was the reminder that Hogak was designed for Commander. They said that. Cool story, bruh. So now you're 2 for 3. That is a decent success rate. That is a Hall of Fame percentage.
The all-time batting record.
Yeah, exactly. The Ted Williams of fucking mistakes.
Yeah,
right.
That is so bad. They do not want to be the Ted Williams of mistakes.
Like, there you are. And if you want to like dig in a little bit more and you look at Sorin Imperious Bloodlord and what that does, like, sure, if that card was not explicitly designed for Commander, but I'll tell you what one of the most popular creature types is, according to Rec. The Wampir. And so when you make show and tell for vampires, it's probably not going to be standard constructed, but it's meant for Commander. So there's just a weird little wiggle that we had. Sorin didn't overrun the format. It was finally like a better card, a vampire better than Nocturnus to put in through it, right?
Yeah.
So you can kind of let that one skirt by, but it's still a Commander card dedicated here. To go through the rest of this list, though, for me, it did leave a little bit to be desired in almost every format, and I don't, like I said, they skimmed the top layer, but I think they needed to go 2 down in most of these formats.
Yep.
The Pioneer metagame, while it looks healthy, is wild to see Phoenix doing that well and have that much of a metagame share, when I believe they continuously mention Treasure Cruise in these BNRs, and they do nothing about it. That deck is
speaking of...
That deck is most likely going to run the next RCQ season unless something new happens with Pioneer. There's a new development, new cards that come in. And so we'll probably be talking about Phoenix in the next BNR, like I'm pretty sure we have for the last 2 or 3 years. You got rid of the mono green Devotion deck by cutting some pieces out over time. I think it's been the deck that's seen the most bannings over time in that format. Cool. It's still there. But people aren't complaining about the play patterns anymore. People don't complain about Phoenix either, so maybe that's what it is. People just aren't loud enough in regards to it. But when it comes to metagame and win rate, like, it is right up there. They can do something about it. They probably should do something about it at the end of the day. They needed to go a little bit deeper on that one.
Yeah, agreed.
Modern, I think, as well. They needed to go a little bit deeper on this. The problem isn't that Nadu and Grief were bad looks. I think they were perfectly fine looks. I think they need to go down a little bit more when we take a look at what's actually happening in Modern. After Eldrazi, we have Mardu and Boros Energy, and there's one card that sits in both of those decks that a lot of people have cited as a problem that also exists inside Jeskai Control. And you're smiling like a doofus. What do you think it is?
Fable.
Flage.
Oh, right. Yeah, sorry, Flage. New guy. Yeah.
Yes. Exactly.
Which you picked and said would be insane.
Yes. The new guy in that deck, combined with Arena of Glory, is like an 18-point life swing if you cast and reanimate Flage that turn. That card is insane and extremely difficult to interact with. Moreover, a lot of people are maligning the fact that you still cannot engage with energy, so it just becomes this resource that turns any energy card into this scaling problem throughout the rest of the game. Guide of Souls or whatever it is not,
which I called out and said would
exactly
be
isn't overperforming. It's performing as it should, which is extremely well in this deck.
Yeah.
That card in particular is also very difficult for modern players that haven't played on MODO to grok. And if you haven't played against it or you haven't talked to judges about this, very infrequently do we get reflexive triggers anymore inside the game. Guide of Souls is not an intervening if it's a reflexive trigger, at which then you have 2 timings to engage with this card and determine which one is the correct one for you to operate within as the opponent. It is not difficult, but it is probably more in-depth than you would think. I had to answer a handful of calls about Guide of Souls and just give the oracle to players and then try and help them as best I can. I can't give them the answer. I just gotta guide them based on the rules text, and it's very difficult even for judges to explain a reflexive trigger to somebody who's never had to deal with one before.
Yeah.
So I think Modern needed to go a little bit deeper as well, and cool, you propped up energy, you called that one up, but maybe you needed to do a little bit more. Maybe getting, Galvanic, not Blast, whatever the one red mana instant removal spell is. Take something low end out of that deck, or Ocelot Pride that creates token hell in the format. and call it a day. I think we needed to go a little bit deeper there as well. I don't know if you've had any kind of experience with Modern in the last couple months.
It was pretty much as I have seen it play out in store. Modern was in a pretty decent place. Most people were happy with the format. Flage showed up, Nadu, and just okay. Like, nobody wants to play it.
Yep.
It felt like for the last, that came out, what, a month ago now?
2 or 3 months. 3 months.
Yeah, or 2 or 3 months now. Sorry, there's so many I can't keep up with them. It felt like Legacy did for basically the last year.
Just waning.
Where everyone said, hey, I just don't want to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And it felt like that. And now I actually, players are excited to play the format again, which I think is good from the LGS perspective. Great. But again, I wish we didn't have to tell our players, hey, this card that was designed for Commander is keeping people away.
Yep. And then I think that's the same thing as well. And then we move on to Legacy, where they banned Grief, and I think that was fine. They skimmed the top layer again, though I remain unconvinced that Grief is the only card that needed to go. I think they actually needed to get 2 cards with this BNR. Maybe 3. The third one being Psychic Frog, which they did say they talked about, and I get that. But only if the conversation's centered around, is this the next spell that puts Delver into the top?
Yeah, is it the next Renin 6, basically?
Well,
does it make your efficient tempo deck insane?
Yeah, after Deathrite Shaman, it is a 2 mana value problem. Everything after that, Dreadhorde Arcanist, Ragavan was clipped as well for being 1 mana. Renin 6, and then Psychic Frog, right? We got to look Expressive Iteration. We've got all these 2 mana value options. As long as that was the conversation, then sure. And the Dimir Tempo deck is basically Delver. Right now, I think people are playing it with Tamiyo mistakenly. It creates this weird mid to long game aspect that's just bad. I think people should be attacking more in Legacy. Actually turn your creature sideways. You can do something between main phase 1 and 2. And I think that's a lesson to learn. It shouldn't just be dirtle yourself. You should actually be engaging with your opponent's jaw and serving for 3. So once people realize that, and that you can actually play a tempo game again with Delver, bring Stifle back, maybe not, Psychic Frog becomes one of the premier game plans for those style of decks. That's the third card. That's fine. I think either Reanimate or Entomb need to go. One of the 2. Yes. So, and I think I mentioned this before on the podcast. If I didn't, I thought about it, and I've had a conversation with people about it. I initially thought the problem was Entomb. If you get Entomb, you make it more difficult for people to put creature cards into the graveyard. You have, or cards in general. Entomb can get anything you want. Anything with Flashback or anything with Dredge. You put it in the graveyard, and cool, you have access to it right there. Or Shifting Woodland, like Vesuvan, not Vesuvan. There's the
Vesuvan Shapeshifter?
No, the Doppelganger from Stronghold that can turn...
Shifty...
Whatever.
No, it's Unstable Shapeshifter. That's the one.
Yeah, it's the one that allows you to put...
the top card.
What's-her-face from Legions into your graveyard and just death touch your opponent from the game. I want it. Phage the Untouchable.
Yes.
Not Flage. Phage. Yeah. Phage.
That was the breakfast list.
Yes, exactly. Full English breakfast, not cephalid breakfast.
Not cephalid. Yeah, the old person breakfast.
Yeah, and so Entomb can do all these really cool and interesting things. I thought it should have been Entomb that goes, because it does so much. It's a 1 mana tutor directly to your graveyard, and aside from we got rid of Vampiric Tutor for a reason.
Yeah.
All the other 1 mana tutors are available because they're and Mystical. We got Mystical and Vamp are gone. We have Enlightened, we have Worldly, we have Gamble. Those 3 are heinous, so we can leave them around. The black tutors had to go.
Yeah.
And that's fine. But that means Entomb can be lumped in there, right? The reason I think Reanimate might need to go is similar to Entomb. The game moves forward, and everything has to be put through some kind of pipeline. And Reanimate in Legacy is the same pipeline that creatures in Modern have to go through. But they banned Birthing Pod. Right? Birthing Pod was that pipe.
Yeah.
And Reanimate is that pipe in Legacy. And as sad as I would be to see the Reanimator deck leave, because that was one of the first decks I played in Extended and thus in Legacy, I can understand why it puts a weird squeeze on the game. So I have a feeling we're going to be revisiting Legacy, and we might actually be banning Reanimate or Entomb, not necessarily for the health of the format, but for the ability to kind of grow the game. If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I think the thing that I first thought Entomb was a problem a very long time ago, because, I mean, this was 8-9 years ago, was sitting down with some friends playing Legacy, and friend was playing Reanimator and just mashing it, and he goes, the best card in the deck is Entomb. And I was like, how? It's just like put a thing in the graveyard. He's like, no, it's a Demonic Tutor for 1 mana in this deck.
Yeah.
I'm like, oh shit, that's right. And that's, like you said, comparing it to Birthing Pod, that only gets better the more integrated creatures get with being everything.
Well, that's the thing. Entomb isn't just creatures; it's any card.
Anything.
That's why. That's why I mentioned Flashback. I mentioned Dredge, the dumbass shapeshifter shifting Woodlot, or whatever it is from Modern Horizons 3. These cards that look into the graveyard or interact from within the graveyard. The pipeline for Entomb is massive in this game. So many cards have to flow through Entomb that it has the ability to break the game in such weird and interesting ways. Like, there are decks that cast Gamble that actually want the card in the graveyard more than in hand. They should be playing Entomb for that. The other thing is, and one of the reasons people were successful against Rescaminator was once they like checked themselves emotionally and realized that like the deck is beatable. There are 4 Entombs. There were 8 reanimation spells. So if you take care of the Entombs, you don't have to deal with the 7/7 and the 6/6. You will have the 3/3, or sorry, the 3/2 and the 6/5, and both of those are eminently more easy to deal with than a 7/7 and a 6/6. So I think we're going to be revisiting both of those cards at some point in time. The format can go on with Buried Alive, or maybe a better Buried Alive that costs 2 or a sorcery speed, etc.
Yeah.
And I know we have is it not Unburial Rights, that's a reanimation spell. We got something in Modern Horizons 2 that puts a non-legendary creature card into the graveyard. It is a sorcery. It costs a colorless and a black. So you can get Archon into the graveyard. You can't get Atraxa because that's a limitation on it. And that card is so inherently bad because it's a sorcery. It costs 2 and it doesn't get legends, that it's nigh unplayable in Reanimator as it stands. And we have that card already, right? So somewhere in between Entomb and that card from Modern Horizons 2 exists the answer for Legacy that makes Reanimator a deck that can exist, can be decently powerful with the options it has in front of it, and also not be a scourge on the format. And that's not to say that people aren't cooking. Like, people are in the lab. The World Gorger Dragon community came out in force this last week. They were just doing the best they could with that deck. And Entomb is a core pillar of that archetype. You need to, no matter how you play it. You could combo out with Archon of Cruelty, or you could combo out with Thoracle. It doesn't matter which direction you go. Entomb is necessary for that deck to operate. Entomb has been, and Reanimate have been, a pillar of that strategy since it wasn't extended. And what 100 players cry out in agony when one of those 2 cards is banned? 100%. But at the end of the day, I think it's a fine look to revisit. So I think Legacy, we needed to go a little bit further than that. In Vintage, I think we might need to go a little bit further as well. We saw Saga and Bauble get restricted. That's fine. I think we might need to start reaching outside the workshops archetype and actually look at, okay, what's going on with the rest of the format that we basically have coalesced around still workshop-based decks. It's probably Jewel that should go. Oath and Luris decks. Is there a common thread through all of them that we could pull and make the format a little more competitive, a little more viable? You don't need the Dredge deck to be good. Bizarre decks don't need to be top tier anymore. They had their moment in the sun in like the mid 2000s, and that's perfectly fine. I understand.
Yeah.
We can't just let that card be good. That's cool. I'm fine with it. But it would be nice to have Initiative be a little more playable. A Stompy deck in Vintage would be, in my mind, fantastic to have.
I think that's great for formats to have.
Yeah. Like, we have...
Especially Vintage.
Yeah, bless his heart, I Am Level 1 has been doing the Lord's work with Paradoxical Outcome donor decks for the last couple months here and there, just putting up putting it up in a league. The fact that we don't really have a Storm deck in Vintage is kind of interesting if it speaks to this kind of mid-range soup that we have. The combo deck is basically Oath, and that just assembles 2 mana sources and a creature on the opponent's side of the board. Sorry. Oath, 2 mana sources, and a creature on the opponent's side of the board. It doesn't matter how that creature gets there, but that's part of the combo.
It's there.
Yeah.
Yep.
Right, that's it. Like, Doomsday combo, not really a thing. It's very lightly played. That deck doesn't need to be the best deck in the format, and it being barely represented, fantastic, I think. When that kind of deck, Storm deck, is one of the best, I think we have a problem with Vintage. But I do think they needed to go a little bit deeper this time around and try and find a thread to pull. But if they want to wait and revisit the Vintage of the next BNR in December, who knows? I think this is a fine look for Eternal Weekend.
Yeah. I think you have to define that next one after it.
Yeah. After you have NYSE happen, you have the results from that. You're going to have the Four Seasons tournament in Italy.
Yep.
You're going to have 3 EWs across the world. Actual factual paper events. Yep. You can come back, you can revisit the format. But I think this is another one where they just needed to go a level deeper. But I do understand the difficulty of doing that with Vintage.
Yeah.
So I'll give them the pass there. That's, like I said up top, why I felt every format had a theme, except for Vintage. And it is just, we're going to peel back the top layer and see what's underneath. I think Vintage is more difficult to do, and it does seem like they kind of pulled back that top layer, but if they wanted to, they would have actually probably straight banned Luris. Again, if they wanted to pull back the top layer. This restriction is fine. I didn't see it needed to be happened. You don't need the Vexing Bauble restriction if you ban Luris again, necessarily. You could let that one ride. It's a trade-off, but at the end of the day, I don't think they pulled the top level back. I think they just towed it.
Yeah. I think they did exactly enough to calm people down to think that they're paying attention.
That's fair. That's a good way to look at it.
Until they have more information after Eternal Weekend. That's the positive spin that I'm going to try to put on it.
Yeah.
And what I'm feeling inside is the this is fine dog still. But I'm hoping that, like you and I said, they have to, as of the December ban and restricted announcement, pay attention to actual Eternal formats after Eternal Weekend and make some changes.
Yes. That'll be after the Modern RCQ season finishes. So we should have a possible re-up here if the Modern format does swing back round and require a little more action. I would assume we're going to see action in Legacy after EW. Am I afraid that Frog is going to take over the format? No, I'm not. It just kind of creates this mid-range soup style format. But I think that's more healthy than the format we were in, despite the fact that people are just going to upcycle a Dimir Tempo shell from like a month ago. Cool, whatever. Maybe you can actually wedge a spell combo deck in here.
Yeah.
You know, and that'll be interesting for the format, but I do think we're going to need to re-up on that. And then again, Vintage, when we come out of EW and we'll have the last big paper events of the year for Vintage, we'll see another ban and then, or restriction or unrestriction.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think Legacy is still a format that is ripe for unrestriction. Like, does Mind Twist really need to be on this list?
I mean, I would love to see a deck that goes black, like Swamp, Dark Rit, Mind Twist.
No, don't get me wrong. I'm all in on that one.
Yeah. So, I mean, and I honestly don't know how good that is sometimes.
And there it is. What's the follow-up? You dump your hand into a Mind Twist and then what? You twiddle your thumbs while your opponent plays Psychic Frog on 2 and just draws 2 cards a turn? Like,
who cares? Yeah, it's not... That's just dumb.
Yeah.
There's a lot of that, that I think... Hey, and you know what? Maybe because when Mystical got put on was the last time Reanimator was like 90% of the meta. If you take Entomb and put it on the list, you can take Mystical off. Who knows?
That one I think is a little more of a problem, but we can sidebar on
get
that.
that when it gets there.
I'll give you a reason why I don't think that card will ever come off the ban list, and it is this: they unbanned Candelabra of Tawnos.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Fair.
And if you're gonna put 2 and 2, if you're gonna put 1 and 1 together and get 2, you're going to Mystical for your Time Spiral to diddle your Candelabras or a reset combo, whatever you're doing. And there's a reset reprint coming in something soon as well. Yeah. So like, Mystical's a dangerous place to be. I love the idea, but
that was a great Star City.
Oh, look! As a Mystical,
the flipping candelabras during the top 8.
Yeah, as a Mystical tutor gamer where I can do it, I am all in on this. But I think that one's a little too dangerous.
We can wish.
Yeah, we literally can. People play those. Speaking of wishing, are you ready for picks?
Yes.
Okay. Let me speed run mine.
Hey, cool.
All right. So this week I am looking at Currency Converter, a card that I've been holding off on talking about because we're finally seeing enough action on it. This is a card from the Streets of New Capenna Commander deck. I think it was in more than one. And it does a lot for 1 mana. And first, it has some passive text. Whenever you discard a card, you may exile that card from your graveyard. Cool. Then 2 and a tap, draw a card, then discard a card. Then tap, put a card exile with Currency Converter into your graveyard. If it's a land card, create a treasure token. If it's a non-land card, create a 2/2 black rogue creature token. Just flat 2/2. It is. And as you can see, we're finally on the upswing back to where it was when the decks basically were released. We're heading up towards $8. When I was taking my notes, CK was buying 25 at $4. They were selling 2 for $7. When they closed up shop tonight, somebody or somebodies had basically filled their quantity. It looks like they bought all 25 from somebody, and they are reselling 1 at $6. So there's a little bit of this weird rub where when I first pulled up the buy page and their JSON slug says they are not buying any at all, and now they're buying 3 at $3.50. So I don't know what's going on with CK, but they're probably going to be buying some in a couple of weeks. On TCG Player, there were 48 listings with a market price of $7.56. Now there's 51 listings with a market price of $7.78. So we're seeing both go up as expected. I added this to my notes in February of 2024. CK was buying 64 at $2.75. They had $8. They had 8 copies. They were selling at $5, and there were 75 listings on TCG Player, and they were selling for a market of $4.24. So we're basically just seeing everything on this card go up over time, which is exactly what we want. Now, when it comes to commander playability, this does everything. And it stops your discarded cards from hitting the graveyard, technically. Realistically, no. They still go in, they create a trigger, and then they exile. So if somebody wants to muck with it, they absolutely can. On the whole, Currency Converter is a pretty interesting card. It does a lot of weird things, like I read. It can protect your graveyard by exiling cards that end up there via discard. It triggers, quote, when a card leaves your graveyard, unquote, effects like on Quintorius Field Historian. And it gives you additional value when you discard cards before you put them into the graveyard to be accessed later on after you put them in the graveyard. Which is weird to say that a card goes to the graveyard twice, but here we are. Currency Converter, it's a difficult card, really, to explain. The value is inherent. The value inherent isn't necessarily in the activated ability to draw and discard, but rather the value accrued by using the second ability and then accruing value from the second half of the second ability, which is weird to say. The first half exiles the card. The second half puts it back. So there's 2 bites at the apple here.
Yeah.
When we look to evaluate this card at the literal commander level, we want to see commanders that make use of either the discard, quote, protection, unquote, like Flubs the Fool, whereby you don't have to worry about the card discard clause because they're going to end up under Currency Converter anyway, and you can access them again. First, they get a little bit of value from Flubs. Then they get a little bit of value after you put them back in your graveyard from Currency Converter. Then you can access them again once they're inside your graveyard. And for those that don't know, Flubs the Fool came out with Bloom Barrow. And it is Teamer colored, green, blue, red for a 0/5 that says, you may play an additional land on each of your turns. Awesome. Whenever you play a land or cast a spell, draw a card if you have no cards in hand. Otherwise, discard a card. So basically, Flubs is looking to just churn through cards in your deck, and this kind of insulates you from that. Everything you discard with Converter out ends up under Converter to turn into a treasure or a zombie before you return the card to your hand, or flash it back, or do whatever it is you're going to do with it once it's there. Then we have commanders like Quintorius Field Historian that looks for when a card leaves your graveyard. And now Quintorius Field Historian says, spirits you control get +1/+0. Cool. Whenever one or more cards leaves your graveyard, create a 3/2 red and white spirit creature token. So that means with Currency Converter out, every card that goes to your graveyard and exiles under Currency Converter makes a 3/2 spirit. Fantastic. Rummage all day long. Then, when you put a non-land card back into your graveyard, you make a zombie. So you're getting 2 different creature tokens for discarding a single card, just for casting your Rummage spell. Every card you discard makes not just a spirit, but later on, a zombie. That is insane value. Now, there are also a few artifacts and other creatures that look for cards leaving graveyards. So these are like additional ways to create value that fall into this camp. I'm pretty sure there's a core set like 2 or 3 years ago that had an artifact that created zombies when cards leave graveyards, and people were trying to basically like combo kill using Delve. Didn't work out well, but that's a card that plays with Currency Converter. Well, with Currency Converter. Like, you have commanders like Rafine, Scheming Seer, and Rona, Herald of Invention, whose triggered abilities are a loot effect, and Converter is effectively quantitative easing, allowing you to access any card you discard, like we've already discussed. And it could be by making a treasure or putting it in your graveyard, making a zombie, and allowing you to recast it later, shuffle it back in, Archaeomancer, whatever you need. Converter plays this really interesting role in decks that want to be moving cards from their hand to their graveyard or from their graveyard to exile, and both of those are for value. And one of the best things you can probably be doing with Currency Converter out is either rummaging or looting. And they are basically the red and blue versions of the exact same effect. You either draw a card and discard a card, or you discard a card and draw a card. Like, rummage is the red, loot is the blue. And like impulse draw, which involves exiling cards to be cast, doesn't work with Currency Converter. You need to literally be putting the cards into your graveyard. And we have so many ways to do that. Like, I assume this does not go in Nekasar lists, but if there was a deck I could pinpoint to that just wants to put all of its cards in the graveyard for profit and value because it means they're casting wheels and killing their opponents in that effect, like, this is the card to help with that.
This is the one, yeah.
Your wheels can be tucked away. You can then get them back later in the next turn, effectively making them very difficult to interact with if people don't have graveyard hate in the moment. You're insulating those additional cards you have to discard. Like, this card just works on so many levels with so many commanders and so many game plans, and also works well against commanders that want you to discard cards.
Yep.
Because it exiles, and then you get inherent value when you put those cards back into your graveyard. Sure, it might not be the same amount of value. A treasure token is not the same as a land, but that still is very powerful for a deck that wants to put you in a resource squeeze. Like, like I said, quantitative easing, here it is. You know, when it comes to a timeline on this card, there were 107 copies total on TCG Player when I was taking my notes. LP and Nearman combined were selling about 5 copies a day, so we were going to be out by the end of the month. The Gaming Co. was anchoring with 24 copies, as expected.
That's also not bad for them. 24 is a little light.
Correct.
So.
But the interesting part here is that they were anchoring those 24 at $9.36. There were 16 total cards between low and them, which meant in 4 days, this would have been a $4 card. And it looks like they are still anchoring with 24 copies. Double checking. Yep, there they are at $9.99. So they are actively repricing their anchor. QED sales is right above them with 18 copies at $9.99. So this card will become $10 basically within 2 weeks if the math holds. That is a 40% increase in price. Awesome. Buy lists, as we noted, are moving, but they're lagging behind even market price. So I would expect to be able to out our copies to TCG Player faster by just relisting. But if you wanted to wait for buy lists, you're probably going to be waiting about a month or two. So it's there. It's just going to take a little longer. Reprint equity on this one. This isn't tied to a plane, right? That's good overall because that means it could be reprinted anywhere.
Yeah.
But that means it could be reprinted anywhere. What I think the barrier to entry on this is really how weird the card is, and that kind of makes it difficult. And that alone should mean that we're only going to see this inside a Commander product in the future.
Yeah.
The difference between where we are now versus where we were with Streets is that we do a lot of impulse drawing in red. So I'm not quite sure where this is going to fit inside a Commander deck, but the theming for Streets of New Capenna kind of made this a great inclusion for those decks. So if we do get something that themes with it, I think we could see a reprint in that deck. So if we get something that cares about, let's say, money or the literal gold tokens that we made for a hot minute before we got to treasures, then we could see it there. And that's kind of what I would expect, but it's going to take that kind of dedicated theming, and I think that might be a little too much for WotC right now.
Yeah.
You got to really lean in, and I don't know if that's where we want to be with the Commander products like that anymore. Based on the last set we know of Duskborn coming out, we shouldn't see it there. Yeah, it's a horror trope set and currency converter, not really a horror card. By quantity wise, I've got one extended art, and that was for Cube, and I think a play
That's
set.
insane in Cube.
Yes. And I think I've got a regular playset because people tried this card in Legacy Rescaminator. There was a minute where we thought we could play Urza Saga, this, and like 2 other targets. And I did not really believe in it, but I still picked up my converters overall. I didn't pull the trigger on getting in these when I should have. Otherwise, I would have picked up a dozen at the time. They just kind of stuck up on me. And at this point, I still feel fine putting in maybe like $60 to $80 on this because the turnaround is going to be so quick if we can just get in now. Even if we have to get in close to like the $9 or $10 market, we move up to like 12 and 15, 16 very, very quickly after the Gaming Co plug is and the QED plugs are pulled.
Yeah. I love this card. I've loved it since it came out. I think it's great value. I only bought 5 of them myself because I didn't think it would last in Scaminator, and it didn't. But this is one that honestly, one of my worries was would it get reprinted at what was seemingly multiple opportunities this year, and it did not. And I think that, obviously, like you said, it's not plane specific, which normally hurts our argument for reprint equity. But with the set design being as thematic as it is, and with them being so deliberate with their card choices and design choices to fit that theme, I just don't see, just random EDH deck, sure, but that's about it.
Yeah.
And this is something that, because it interacts with the graveyard, with discarding, it's always going to be relevant as they make more creatures, as they make more commanders that interact with the graveyard and discarding. This card only stands to gain and get better, and it's just a really good advantage engine. It does everything. I love this card. It is one of my favorite cards from a design perspective from the last couple of years. It's awesome.
Yeah, it doesn't get a lot of heat from the content creator side of things, so that's one of the reasons why I was dragging my feet on it. It did so well in Cube. It seems to overperform in Cube. It's a high pick in Cube. It saw a little bit in Legacy play, and at that point, I was just like, all right, I got to pay attention to this card. This seems like something that's going to be very real coming out of basically Cube exploration for once. So I sat on it, and then, per the graph, we were a little late on this announcement, so I moved it up in pick order, and I think this is just going to be one of those things where we can ride it to the moon.
Yeah.
All right, you got a big chonker of a card.
So, I'm gonna get
Jiggy with it?
yeah, we'll get jiggy with it. So, Wizards has a habit
Yes.
of with ban and restricted announcements, and my pick is on theme. It is OG Ravnica Court of Calling. And the reason I am calling this out is because there have been throughout history of Magic multiple times where a card was discussed multiple times in other ban and restricted announcements. We're worried about how it's going to impact this. We worry about this. And I did a little research after the recent announcement of MODO, and I was curious, how many times have certain cards been mentioned? And in the last 3 years, Court of Calling has been mentioned in the banning of cards that didn't involve Court of Calling getting banned, but it was about its interaction with those cards. So I basically am putting this in as, kind of a sell call on Court of Calling. And it's basically, hammering home the, hey guys, hold on to it exactly long enough to turn it into 20%, because they have a habit of saying, we don't want to ban Hogak, and then they ban Hogak after they ban around it. They have a habit of saying, oh, we don't want to ban Mopal, and then they ban Mopal after banning cards around it. And it's something they've done. A Monastery Mentor was a great example in Vintage. I think it was for the Ponder, or maybe Preordained Restriction, before they recently unrestricted it. They mentioned Monastery Mentor 7 times in one announcement for the banning of a cantrip in Vintage. And then eventually they said, you know what, maybe this is the mistake. I think not necessarily Cord, but cards like Cord are the mistake. And I think that after this ban and restricted announcement, I actually have a little bit more faith that Wizards of the Coast will hit those problem cards. So I'm not saying it's necessarily time to clutch your pearls and get scared, obviously, but when it comes time for these ban and restricted announcements, maybe be thinking about something else that could get hit seemingly out of nowhere, like Grief, which was not something people had really been screaming for to get banned. But if they're trying to be more prescient about the problems that will result after it and get ahead of that and define these formats, it's something we need to start keeping in mind, because it's seeming like these timelines are getting shorter and shorter for Wizards to say, hey, we messed up and this is bad. This is the problem card. We're going to hit it. And I think MODO is, a unique data point in that pattern. I don't think by any means this means, hey, next ban and restricted announcement, it's gone. I think they will try to let the format settle, but be looking when these times come. Kind of like I talked about last episode when I mentioned Stoneforge and how Grief suppressed Stoneforge. We did not get insider information. But be mindful of what's around these cards. Things that could come with it as well. And maybe say, hey, look, you know what? If we're going to take a little bit of a hit for this by listing it to Card Kingdom instead of waiting, we're comfortable with that. We'll get another one if it's not banned. That's fine. And that's basically what I wanted to call out, because I think that that's something that now, again, as we enter seemingly a more defined market with the modern print cycle, the modern release cycle that we're on, these things are starting to get more concrete, and we can start to say, okay, this is now how things are. This is the reality of the situation with this game, and we need to start looking at it that way. And I just wanted to call that out.
Yep, and this is another point in time where we can talk about trend tracking, because you can start trend tracking these BNR announcements. And I assume in some of those announcements where they talked about Cord, they also talked about Collected Company right next door. That all those cards kind of go hand in hand right now.
Yeah.
The difference is that there's a fail rate on Collected Company. And the difference between Collected Company and Finale of Devastation, a card that has shown up from time to time, is Sorcery Speed.
Yeah.
Or I guess Court of Calling and Finale is Sorcery Speed. And then the ability to tutor out of the graveyard when you hit X equals 10 or something like that.
Yeah.
And that's fine. Cool, dandy. But the problem cards are Cord and Collected Company, because they are instant speed. And they allow for some very interesting things to happen, because they tutor creatures directly into play. So you can either tutor your bullets exactly with Court of Calling, which is basically how the Birthing Pod chain could start if you needed it to. Or you could attempt to beat the house with Collected Company and see what happens. And if at the end of the day, WotC does decide that creature decks in Pioneer should exist, but they should not be able to tutor up their bullets or their combo pieces exactly. They will get rid of Chord. Modern doesn't have this problem because creature combo decks generally not that strong in the format, as we mentioned up top. They're a little too slow, a little too clunky, and open to the more aggressive kind of interaction that Modern allows for over Pioneer. You have free counter spells in that format. You have free removal spells in that format. People have the ability to interact in a much more meaningful way and a much more engaging way in those formats. It's a little more self-policing in that regard. Yeah. Moreover, if the card Path to Exile existed in Pioneer, Amalia might not have been a problem. TBD on that one. But looking at Court of Calling as a sell prospect is not a bad look overall, especially when you realize they just keep printing it.
It's constant.
Yeah. I did not realize they upcycled the original Ravnica art in Ravnica Remastered. That I forgot about the Double Masters printing, and then there's also the 30th anniversary promo on top of a Secret Lair and the Magic 2015 promo. It seems like every 3 or 4 years we get at least one Court of Calling reprinting. So this is not just a safe place to keep money unless you have foils from Ravnica.
Which OG foils from that era, same with Kamigawa, whatever. Obviously, those are not going to go down. Fine, whatever.
Yeah. So as a sell call, I think this is great. And again, as a learning opportunity, I think this is also a fantastic option as well. We have a number of cards that were mentioned in the August 26th ban announcement in each of the formats as kind of possible ancillary targets moving forward if the health of these formats doesn't head back to where WotC expects if they are not above board. And so just like the call with the One Ring you made a couple of weeks ago, there's opportunity here to get ahead of basically the market by reading and understanding the context of the other cards mentioned around the one or ones that were banned. Because they are most likely next. So I like this overall as a look. I added my Court of Callings that I didn't play a couple of years ago, and I do not feel bad about that. I think I lost out on a handful of them because I Mengu financed them. But at the end of the day, like you said, if you got to turn it into 20% just to reclaim that space, reclaim some of the money at a perfect time to do this, and consider the lesson learned from alongside these announcements, the actual value here. So good pick. Anything else before we cut out?
That's it.
All right. So for at MTG Cabalcast on Twitter, Facebook, Patreon, and YouTube, I am at Halt, I am Reptar. You are
at Damon_Thurston.
We'll see you next week.